And thank you very much for inviting me. Well, first of all, I have some good and some bad news for you. The bad news is that English is not my first language, which means that I might struggle a little bit through this presentation. But the good news is that I will not go on for a full hour. I aim at 30 minutes or so, and then Caroline will take over, so just hang in there and things will get better. As you can see, the title of this presentation is How to Successfully Implement the HCR-20 into Practice. Could actually have used this title, at least the first 8 years. But on the other hand, the last 10 years have been much more pleasant and much more successful. And I will get back to this soon. I just want to provide you with a short background to my interest in this. In 1992 in Sweden, we seemingly out of nowhere got a new forensic psychiatric legislation. And among other things, it stated that we could only discharge our forensic psychiatric patients if there were no risk for recidivism. And I mean, risk, that was actually very surprising and very confusing at the time, because 1992, we all knew perfectly well risk, prediction, dangerousness. That's something totally impossible, and it's very, very unethical. And just the thought of taking actions towards someone for something that that person might do in the future. I mean, and you have to remember, there are many Norwegians here, and we in Scandinavia, we were very influenced by prominent scholars like Thomas Mathisen, Nils Christie, and others. So this was actually very, very surprising. I didn't know what to do, but you know, I guess you all know what to do when you run into trouble. You contact the superheroes. So I contacted the Canadian superheroes because I heard of a man named Webster something that was working with this impossible and unethical issues. I contacted him. I asked him for permission to come to Vancouver and see what he was doing. I went there because I got permission from him to come, and I expected to meet a man that looked like this. We all know this is how Canadians look like. But met a man that looks like this. Looks like the nicest person on earth. And as a matter of fact, he is. He is the nicest person on earth. And among other things, he gave me this. Here it is. Here it was, the brand new version 1 of the HCR-20 scheme, as it was called at that time. If you look carefully, you can see young Kevin Douglas is already in there. Other famous names like Randy Kropp is in there, and a few others. And this was something completely new to me, of course. I opened it, I read the introduction, and Chris wrote something like, "We're not very good at violence prediction, but since we are required to perform risk assessments, maybe we have to do them as good as we can." And to me, that sounded actually quite plausible for a man that had no idea what he was talking about. So I went on reading, and he said, what is offered here is a set of definitions concerning factors which might be related to actual violence in the particular case. Already here, you can see how the structured professional judgment base was formulated in a way. And what he then did, I think, was a stroke of genius. He offered 20 general arguments against the HCR-20. Typical Chris Webster stuff. And it proved to be exactly the arguments I had, and most other people at that time had. That's my guess, at least. And what Chris and his co-author did was that he proved all of us to be wrong. Argument after argument. Just to give you a couple of examples, this is argument number 1. The proposed system violates ethical standards. No, it doesn't. The scheme does not take into account the characteristics of the assessors. Yes, it does. It seems improbable that all the complexities, etc., can be reduced to 20 items. Yes, of course, but it's not a test. Bring them in if it's something else that you think is important, etc., etc. And one of these arguments was very interesting to me. Chris wrote, some persons may be highly dangerous and present large management difficulties despite the fact that they score high on one or only a few variables, and he added, the scheme aims not so much at yielding a score, etc. This was a little bit surprising to me and confusing because at that time, as Steve mentioned before, the Pink Book had been published. The Pink Book that looked actually like this, the Violence Prediction Scheme. You can see I actually have read it. And that was, to me, a very, very actuarial tool because I focused very much on the RAG, the Risk Assessment Guide, and all the cutoffs, the scores, the weighted items. I didn't notice, actually, to be honest, at the time, the assess list that I now know was very much Chris Webster's work, but I focused on the other stuff. And, well, as Steve already told you, Chris Webster and the other authors, they went off on very different directions from there on. I'm not going to say anything about prediction, but I can't help recommending to you this very new, wonderful article in the most recent issue of Behavioral Sciences and the Law, where Professors Hart and Cooke deal with this question in detail. I really recommend it. Back to Webster and his arguments. One of his arguments very much came to be kind of the starting point for me in my work. He said, it's not clear how the instrument is to be used in actual practice. No one had ever tried that before. And by now, I have started to understand that this man he knew what he was talking about. I started to understand what risk assessment is about. So, when I came back to Sweden after my second trip in 1997, I brought with me the brand new version 2 of the HCR-20. I translated it, I had it printed in a nice manual, and started to train all members at that hospital. Växjö Forensic Psychiatric Hospital is one of Sweden's 5 biggest hospitals with 100+ patients, something like that. We were all very, very enthusiastic about this. We had plans, we made plans for establishing risk assessment teams and groups, we had meetings, we performed an extensive inter-rater liability study, etc. Well, everyone was excited except someone like to guess? The doctors. The doctors weren't very impressed. And I like to say now, so that I don't forget to say that, I mean, many doctors at the time understood what the HCR-20 was about and what it wasn't about. I mean, people like Göran Fransson and Erik Söderberg and Marianne Christiansson and others, they realized immediately what this was. But actually, many doctors in Sweden at the time didn't understand this at all. They said things like, well, this is unethical, it's impossible, it's only doctors who know anything about risk, don't interfere with our clinical work, etc., etc. And this particular group of doctors at these particular hospitals were very, very active. And my struggle began. They filed complaints to the Research Ethics Committee stating that doing research work out from the HCR-20 was very, very unethical. They filed complaints to the university. They even actually made anonymous phone calls to the university, warned them to hire such an unethical doctor as Dr. Belfrage. They filed complaints to the National Psychiatric Association, the National Forensic Psychiatric, Association. They contacted the media. Sometimes I had, almost on a daily basis, had to try and explain for journalists what this was and what this wasn't. They filed complaints to the National Board for Health and Welfare, and they came to the hospital and had an inspection. They stayed for several days. I had to answer questions for hours and hours, trying to explain what this was and what this wasn't. And actually, this went on for years. And finally, the year 2000, they wanted to convict me for using the HCR-20 in forensic psychiatric treatment. That's actually true. And I mean, the year 2000, it's not that long ago. Finally, in 2003, something very important happens. In Sweden, we had a series of very violent crimes committed by mentally ill patients. One man drove his car right into this old town in the Stockholm city center and killed and injured a lot of people. One other person just killed someone who happened to pass him on the street, etc. And this created this debate among issues like are mentally ill persons more dangerous than others, etc. But very much in focus this time came risk assessments. Why hadn't the doctors, the psychiatrists, performed any risk assessments? Then, again, the Swedish National Board for Health and Welfare stepped forward and said, well, we don't have any exact methods of performing risk, and concluded we shouldn't do risk assessments. And that was, of course, very confusing to many of us, because at the same time we had this legislation that told us that we have to do this risk assessments. But what happened just a few months after this was a very terrible thing, actually, and the date was actually September 11. Our foreign minister, Anna Lindh, was attacked and murdered in the middle of Stockholm city by a man named Mijailo Mijailovic. And as if this wasn't enough, the members of the staff at a general psychiatric hospital, a locked ward, but a general psychiatric hospital, they gathered the patients because they wanted to, in sort of an organized way, tell them what had happened. Unfortunately, among those patients, there was one young man that had documented violent thoughts. He had, just a couple of days before this, he started to act out towards children. And as soon as he received this information, he raised his hand, asked for permission to leave the ward. And tragically and unfortunately, he received that permission. He went right out, got a knife, went to the nearest kindergarten and he stabbed the 5-year-old girl with 60 stabbings. Horrific thing. Of course, a very big thing, a new debate. And now, this was such a big thing, so the National Board couldn't settle with just an inspection. They had to launch a full investigation. And a year after, in 2004, they presented this investigation. And now, they convicted 5 doctors for not having performed risk assessments. Everything suddenly turned 360 degrees around. And it was quite clear what they expect from psychiatry from there on. They stated that risk assessments in all kinds of psychiatry, not just forensic psychiatry, shall be done. Shall be documented routines for how to do them. These assessments shall be documented in the patient files and journals. And you can't do them, they have to be evidence-based. So everything changed just out from one horrific case. And today, I constantly hear of hospitals in Sweden that actually are being fined by the National Board because they haven't performed HCR-20 risk assessments. So to conclude this little introduction, I think that you're probably going to have much easier than I had. the first 8 years or so. At least let's hope so. Over the years, working with this, I've made many mistakes. I won't tire you telling you about all those mistakes, but let me mention 4 of them. And actually the first one is not so much my mistake, but it has created so much problems over the years. Numbers and scores. Because as you remember, the first 2 versions of the HCR-20 had numbers. They just meant no, partly yes, O means no, etc., etc. Do not add up scores. That's the message. And I was very careful during my training with the staff to stress that. I repeatedly told them, remember now, O means no, 1 means partly, 2 means yes, do not add up scores, do not add up scores. Do you think that helped? Didn't help. I could hear quite often people talking, saying things like, well, oh, you know, this guy has 27, he's a really dangerous patient, but that guy over there is just a score of 17. Maybe we could discharge him soon, and things like that. I tried everything. At one point, I even added a cover sheet on top of every score sheet at the hospital saying, remember, O means no, etc., do not add up scores. Nothing helped. So again, I contacted the superheroes and asked for permission to add a score sheet to the Swedish manual, where we took away O12 and replaced with NPY. And suddenly everything changed. Everyone immediately realized what this was and what this wasn't. And I think it's kind of a psychological thing. If there's number, you add up scores. And actually, Professors Hart and Cooke discussed this a little bit in their article I referred to, talking about anchoring bias and stuff like that. So you just have to read that article. It's good that you probably know that there are no numbers in version 3. Kevin was ruled out. Another mistake over the years, well, I tried in vain for years to set up risk assessment teams led by or dependent on the doctor. That will never work. It was natural for me to do that because doctors are important players in risk assessments, but doctors are more or less interested in these issues. They are not all the time trained in performing risk assessments. Doctors come and go. Doctors are busy. If you're dependent on one person, it will never work. And I will come back to this a little bit later on. Another mistake is you have to understand that this takes resources. If you want this to work, you have to put in extra resources. You can't put this on top of everything else. That will never work. In Sweden, at the hospitals I'm working, we have approximately 100 plus patients at both hospitals, and we strive for assessing these patients every 6 months, which is good because all our patients have their right to have their cases tried in court every 6 months. So it's perfect for us to do that. And if you do that and you have 100 patients, well, that's 200 assessments a year, and we don't have many more working days a year than this. So you actually have to employ people to do this. I will come back to this a little bit later too. And another mistake I did for years, I didn't properly inform or train the court what this was all about. And I realized that even in Sundsvall, where everything, I mean, the doctors were so positive to this, they never really used the risk assessment team's assessments when they came up in court. Until I had a meeting with the court, informed them what the HCR-20 is all about, and suddenly they started to ask questions to the doctors, and immediately the doctors became very interested to take part of and learn more about the HCR-20. So that's important to do. Some recommendations that I would like to give you. It's important to have independent risk assessment teams. I will get back to a little bit later on why independent, why I use the word independent. It's also important that people at the hospital or the institution are well aware of the different aims with performing risk assessments. The most important aim, maybe, is to yield information to all members of the staff involved in the treatment process so that you focus on the important things. But one other aim is to yield information to the court. After all, at least in our system, it's the court that decides, they make decisions. And they got to have as good information as possible. And it's also important for research and evaluation. I mean, in Sweden, we have strong demands from our politicians that actually evaluate what we are doing and show that what we are doing actually has some effect. Otherwise, we might get into trouble. And if you implement a risk assessment tool like the HCR-20, it's quite easy to create databases where you can do lots of nice things out from there. And important for me is that you can actually evaluate the treatment while the patients still are patients. Because, as you know, the traditional way of evaluating what we are doing is that we treat our patients for 3, 4, 5 years, we discharge them, and then we wait for 3, 4, 5 years, and then we follow them up in the police register. And probably end up with a recidivism rate of, let's say, 42%. Is that good? Is that bad? Is the fact that one of our patients recidivated into new violence 3 years after he was discharged from our hospital, does that tell us that everything in our treatment process was bad? Was something good? Was everything good but something else happened? We just don't know. But if you perform risk assessment constantly over time, that makes it possible to actually evaluate this while the patients still are at the institution. I had some slides that Kevin already have showed you here. We looked at the admission and discharge, so we could actually show politicians that what we do have some effects. Here we have followed a big group of patients over time, and as you can see, it's small, but it's significant. But everything is more clear if you manage to control for various diagnoses. Actually, to be honest, I can't really remember exact the diagnosis here, but what I do remember is that we have the psychopaths. We can't do much about them, but my guess is that here we have psychosis, Kevin? Yeah, something like that. And there you can see a dramatic drop of risk factors. This is important to be able to show politicians and other important people. At Sundsvall and Vadstena today, where I work, special forensic psychiatric hospitals, 100+ patients at each hospital. We have risk assessment teams at both hospitals. In Sundsvall, for example, we have 2 people employed 100%. 100%. They do nothing else than perform risk assessment. And they are actually in the room, Mats and Lars Henrik. We have 2 other people employed 50%, and they perform more than 200 assessments every year. And on top of that, they give courses, they train members of the staff repeatedly, they perform, sometimes general psychiatry needs help with expert opinions, etc. They perform external assessments, and all the administration, all the databases. So it's a lot of work. You have to actually employ people to do this. What we do is that we strive for, we have what we call treatment planning meetings. Every 6 months, every patient is subject to treatment planning meeting. And these meetings take place a couple of weeks, 3-4 weeks before they proceed in court. And of course, it's extremely important to have an updated risk assessment as a base for those meetings. So that's what we try to do. And I just want to focus and stress how important it is to focus on risk factors. We performed a study in a maximum security prison in Sweden a couple of years ago. very, very influenced by a study by Professor Cooke in the Scottish prison system. And what we did was that my good friend and colleague, forensic psychiatrist Göran Fransson, some of you may have met him. If you have, you haven't forgot him. We did actually a lot of work in that prison. We assessed no less than 47 inmates. And actually, there was none of those, but both Randy Kropp and Kevin Douglas have performed real-life assessments in the Swedish prison system, which I think is impressive. We learned a lot from that. What Göran and I did, we at 3 wards at the hospitals, we performed real-life HCR-20 assessments, including PCL assessments, etc. And after every assessment, we sat down together with the staff and went through our assessments. We told them about the diagnosis. We told them about risk factors. We supervised them. We said things like, well, the problem, the most important risk factors with this particular inmate is these factors, and what might happen is this. If so, a good management would likely be this. And after a year, we reassessed everyone, and we had expected the risk factors in our clients to drop. We were not very happy about the result because it turned out no decrease whatsoever in any kinds of risk factors. But we noticed that the severe violent incidents at the wards had showed a remarkable decrease. And then we realized that, I mean, the inmates were personality disordered, violent offenders, most of them with many psychopathic traits. It's not easy to decrease in the risk factors in those people. So what we did, we didn't change the clients, we changed the staff. I think because they became more focused on the important risk factors. So that learned us a lot, that how important it is to focus on risk factors. The risk assessment teams, they are responsible not only for performing risk assessments, but also for everything around that. It's, you know, bookings, administration. Just want to show you an example. Here's the patient waiting list at one of the hospitals. It's just an Excel file, but it's run again against the computer clock, so it's revised every 24 hours. And I like the color system here. As long as it's 60 days or more left to these treatment planning meetings, it's green. But when it comes between 30 and 60 days left, it turns yellow. And when it's under 30 days left, it turns red. It's good to have this visual thing so you know how the waiting list looks like. What the risk assessment team does, they interview the patients, at least at the first assessment. The reassessments, usually you don't have to do that. I mean, you can interview the members of the staff, the psychologists, etc. The contact persons, as we call them, we have the system in Sweden where one member of the staff has a particular responsibility for this particular patient. They always participate during interviews and discussions afterwards. The risk assessment team, of course, have regular contacts with all members of the staff, doctors, psychologists, etc. But, and I think this is very important, the team performs the assessment. What we don't want to happen is what has happened, that, for example, a psychologist enters the room to the risk assessment team and says, "This risk assessment you performed on my patient is rubbish. I've been working with this patient for 8 years. He's low risk, not high risk. I want a revised version of that risk assessment on my desk tomorrow." This has actually happened. I think for research purposes, it's important to me the team performs the risk assessment, and for principal reasons. If we have various thoughts about risk at an institution, That is very important for the court to know, and the court makes the decision. That's their job. We don't want to be the court, because that's what happens if we try to get to any consensus before we go to court. So it's important to have independent risk assessments. What this risk assessment team does is that they produce one very, very concentrated page. It's very seldom more than a page. It's more often half a page. It's kind of a risk formulation. Most often it boils down to a couple of very important things for this particular patient. And the score sheet, everything is scanned into the computer system, the data journal. So everyone at the clinic can all the time have access to this. The doctors, psychologists, other members of the staff, and the court. And this is very good, because in Sweden, if we go back a couple of years, because I know this because I interviewed the court about these things, when the doctors appeared in court, the court very rarely asked any questions at all, because we have to trust the doctor. That's what they say. We have to trust the doctor. Not a good system, because, I mean, the doctor becomes the court. But now, when they have access to the HCR-20 risk formulation and the score sheet, they have started to ask questions. So let's say, for example, if my colleague and friend, Dr. Fransson, comes up in court and say something like this. Well, I've been working with this patient for 4 years now. He's improving very well. He is no longer under medication. He has been on permissional leave 1 day a week. And I suggest that we expand this to 2 days a week. 4 or 5 years ago, the court would probably have said, yes, Dr. Fransson, good suggestion, Dr. Fransson. But now, my guess is that they will probably say something like this. That's very interesting and sounds good, Dr. Fransson, but tell me, the risk assessment team has assessed a score of 2, or yes, I should say, or Y on... I have to give Kevin some credit too. Well, tell me, the risk assessment team scored a Y on lack of insight for this particular patient. Tell me, Dr. Fransson, what does that mean in this particular case? And Dr. Fransson has to defend his conclusion. And I think that's good because, I mean, we're dealing with important issues, discussing locking people up, etc., etc. You have to be able to defend your opinions here. So, and this has happened in Swedish courts now after having implemented the HCR-20, so that's a good thing. What we also have, which I think is really good, we have established a risk group. That's a broader group, including all members, all clinicians at the hospitals, the risk assessment team, the researchers. Sometimes it's good to discuss some complicated cases. You can't meet in a whole group and discuss every case, but some cases are good to discuss. Sometimes it's the risk team that initiate these meetings, but most often it's the doctors. They feel like, for example, they have been working with this serial rapist. He has been at the clinic for 8 years. He's behaving perfectly well. Nothing has happened for 8 years. I mean, this can't go on like this. What can I do? It's good to discuss these issues. Actually, in Sundsvall, this is mandatory before we think of discharging the people. So, to conclude, try to establish independent risk assessment teams. And remember, you have to actually employ people to do this. They have to be responsible not only for performing risk assessments, but also for all the administration of these assessments. It's important to inform and train all members of the staff at the hospital repeatedly. It's important that the court or the review board or whatever system you have are aware of what this is, because it's important that they put pressure on the organization and establish a risk group. And I think after all the years I've been working with this, if you manage to do this, well, the future will be much better than my history, so to speak. So I think I stop there and well, give the word to Caroline.
I think time for questions, maybe?
Oh, yep.
Yes. Well, thank you so much.